I could not ask for anything more, and I couldn't ask for anyone else. And the love that we found will shine in this city tonight. Yes, it will.
On a cool Saturday afternoon, the city square was full of life. Families walked together carrying shopping bags. Office workers stopped to buy coffee before heading home. Children laughed as pigeons scattered across the stone pavement. Street performers filled different corners with music, paintings, and small magic shows. It was the kind of place where people usually hurried past without paying much attention to strangers. Near the old fountain stood a weathered upright piano. Its dark wood had faded after years of standing outdoors, but every key still worked. A young woman sat quietly on the small bench in front of it. Her clothes were clean but simple. She carried herself with calm confidence, never asking anyone for money or attention. She simply rested her hands on the piano and began to play. The first few notes floated gently through the square. People slowed their steps. Within moments, conversations became quieter. A couple stopped in the middle of their walk. A delivery driver leaned against his bicycle. Even children who had been running around the fountain turned to listen. There was something different about the music. It was not loud or flashy. It felt warm, peaceful, and deeply emotional. The young woman kept her eyes on the piano keys. She smiled only slightly as she played, almost as if the music itself was speaking for her. A small wooden box sat beside the piano for anyone who wished to leave a donation. Some people dropped in a few coins. Others placed folded bills inside before continuing on their way. She nodded politely to everyone but never interrupted her performance to thank them. The music was her only conversation. Leaning against one side of the piano was an old notebook with worn brown covers. Its pages were filled with handwritten musical notes, small corrections, and faded pencil marks. It looked like something that had been used for many years. As each song ended, another began without pause. Some melodies were joyful. Others sounded as if they carried memories too deep for words. More people gathered with every passing minute. Several audience members took out their phones to record the performance. "I've never heard anyone play like this," one older man quietly said. "It sounds like every song tells a story," replied a woman standing beside him. A teenager watching the performance whispered to his friend, "She must be professionally trained." Nobody knew much about the pianist. She appeared in the square a few afternoons every week, played for a few hours, and then disappeared before sunset. She never advertised herself. She never argued with other performers for space. She simply arrived, played beautiful music, and left. Across the street, a black luxury car slowly stopped near the entrance of the square. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door. An older gentleman dressed in an expensive dark suit climbed out. His silver hair was neatly combed, and every movement reflected confidence built over many decades. People recognized him almost immediately. He had spent years serving as one of the country's most respected judges before retiring. Even after leaving the courtroom, his opinions carried weight. Newspapers often quoted him on legal matters. Universities invited him to give speeches about justice and honesty. He believed that truth mattered more than popularity. As he walked through the square, several people greeted him politely. He returned each greeting with a brief nod. The sound of the piano caught his attention before he reached the fountain. He stopped. Without saying a word, he listened. For a few moments, even he seemed impressed by the performance. Then his eyes moved toward the old notebook resting against the piano. One page had fallen open because of a gentle breeze. From where he stood, he could see lines of handwritten music covering the paper. Nearby, two women were talking while watching the performance. "I heard she writes all these pieces herself," one of them said. "Really? That's incredible," the other answered. "No wonder so many people come to hear her." The retired judge glanced at the notebook once more. His expression slowly changed. Over the years, he had seen many cases involving fake artists, dishonest fundraisers, and people who used emotional stories to earn sympathy. Experience had taught him to question impressive claims before believing them. He stepped closer. The crowd naturally made room for him. The pianist finished another melody, and soft applause filled the square. Before she could begin the next piece, the older gentleman spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "So, these are your original compositions?" The young woman looked up politely. She answered calmly, "I play music that means something to me." He pointed toward the notebook. "But are those pieces truly yours?" The sudden question caused the surrounding conversations to stop. Everyone looked from the judge to the pianist. She remained seated. "I never said every melody was written by me," she replied. One of the women from the crowd interrupted. "I thought someone told me they were." The pianist gave a small shake of her head. "People sometimes make assumptions. I don't stop every conversation to correct every rumor." The retired judge folded his arms. "Yet you allow people to believe you created music that may belong to someone else." A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Some people looked uncertain. Others continued defending the pianist. "I've watched her play for months," one man said. "She's never claimed to be famous." Another person replied, "Still, maybe the judge has a point." More phones were lifted into the air. The atmosphere that had felt peaceful only minutes earlier suddenly became tense. The pianist remained surprisingly calm. She closed the notebook and placed it gently beside the piano. "I don't deceive anyone," she said softly. The retired judge looked directly at her. "Then explain this notebook." "It contains music collected over many years." "Collected from where?" "My family." "Can you prove that?" She hesitated. "There are some stories that don't come with documents." The answer seemed to strengthen his doubts. He slowly turned toward the growing crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "talent deserves respect, but honesty deserves even more. We should never admire someone simply because their story sounds convincing." The words landed heavily. Some members of the audience quietly stepped away. Others looked disappointed. The donation box remained untouched. The young woman lowered her eyes for a brief moment but did not argue. She understood that once doubt entered people's minds, defending yourself often became harder than staying silent. The retired judge faced her once again. "If your talent is genuine," he said firmly, "then prove it." She looked up. "How?" "Play something no audience has ever heard. No famous composer. No old family piece. No borrowed melody. Play only what truly belongs to you." The square became completely silent. Even the birds around the fountain seemed to disappear into the background. Every phone camera focused on the piano. The young woman rested both hands above the keys but did not press them. She took one slow breath. Then she looked at the older gentleman with quiet confidence. "You believe music only matters if someone can prove where it came from," she said. He answered without hesitation. "I believe truth always matters." She nodded gently. "Then listen carefully." Her fingers slowly touched the first key. The entire crowd held its breath, waiting to hear what would happen next. This ending leads directly into part 2, where the first notes of the mysterious melody begin and change everything. The first note was so soft that some people wondered if they had imagined it. Then another note followed, and another. The melody moved slowly through the square like a quiet conversation. It was simple. It was not filled with fast runs or dramatic moments. Yet every note seemed to carry a feeling that words could not explain. The crowd became completely silent. Nobody looked at their phones anymore. Even those who had been recording lowered their hands without realizing it. The music demanded attention all on its own. The retired judge stood with his arms crossed, ready to prove his point. At first, his face showed the same calm confidence as before. But after only a few seconds, something changed. His eyes narrowed. The color slowly faded from his face. His hands, which had been resting comfortably, tightened without him noticing. The melody continued. It rose gently before falling into a peaceful rhythm, almost like someone softly humming to a child before bedtime. A memory appeared in his mind without warning. He saw a small wooden house from many years ago. Rain tapped against the windows. A little boy sat on a blanket near a fireplace while his mother smiled from an old piano in the corner of the room. She played that exact melody. Not something similar. Not almost the same. The exact melody. The retired judge suddenly forgot about the crowd around him. For a brief moment, he was no longer standing in the city square. He was back in that warm little house where life had once felt simple. His mother would always play the same tune whenever storms filled the evening sky. She never wrote the music down. She never performed it for anyone else. She simply called it our quiet song. She used to smile every time she finished. Then she would tell him, "As long as you remember this melody, you will always remember home." He had not heard those notes in more than 40 years. Not once. After his mother's passing, the old piano had been sold when the family moved away. The melody slowly disappeared from his daily life until it became only a distant memory. Or so he had believed. Back in the square, the young pianist continued playing without looking up. She had no idea what was happening inside the older man's mind. The music reached its final few notes before gently coming to an end. Silence remained. Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke. People simply looked from the pianist to the retired judge, confused by the expression on his face. His eyes had become wet. One woman whispered, "Is he crying?" Another quietly answered, "I think he is." The judge took a slow breath before speaking. His voice sounded very different now. "Where?" He stopped for a moment. His throat felt dry. He tried again. "Where did you learn that melody?" The pianist looked surprised by the question. "My grandmother taught it to me." The answer came naturally. She had no reason to hide it. The judge stared at her. "Your grandmother?" She nodded. "She played it when I was little. Later she taught me every note." "Did she write it herself?" "I don't know." "Did she tell you where it came from?" The young woman thought carefully before answering. "She only said it was a gift from someone kind of very long time ago." The crowd listened closely. Nobody interrupted. The judge asked another question. "Did she ever mention a name?" The pianist slowly shook her head. "No. She said the music mattered more than the name." Those words landed heavily. The retired judge closed his eyes for a brief second. His mother had often said something very similar. A good song does not belong to one person forever. It belongs to every heart that keeps it alive. He remembered hearing those exact words as a child. His heartbeat became faster. His logical mind searched for another explanation. Maybe it was only a coincidence. Maybe someone had copied the melody years ago. Maybe his memory was playing tricks on him. Yet deep inside, none of those answers felt right. He knew every pause, every rhythm, even the tiny change near the ending. They were all exactly the same. No recording of that melody had ever existed. His mother had never published it. She had never performed in concerts. She played it only inside their home. How could this young woman possibly know it? The crowd continued waiting. The tension had completely changed. Only minutes earlier, people had expected the pianist to defend herself. Now everyone wanted answers from the retired judge instead. An older man from the audience finally spoke. "You asked her to prove herself." Another woman added, "She did." Someone else quietly said, "Now it looks like you're the one with questions." The judge ignored the comments. His attention never left the pianist. "What else did your grandmother tell you?" The young woman smiled gently as she remembered. She said music should never be used to make people feel small. Those words struck him even harder. His mother believed exactly that. When he was a little boy, she often invited neighborhood children into their house. Some could barely play. Some had never touched a piano before. She welcomed every one of them. She never laughed at mistakes. She always believed kindness helped people learn faster than criticism. The retired judge slowly looked down at the ground. He remembered those days clearly now. Life had changed after his father passed away. Money became difficult. His mother worked long hours while still finding time to teach music whenever she could. Many children came and went through their home. He had forgotten most of their faces. Could one of those children have carried the melody into another family? The thought refused to leave him. The young pianist carefully closed her notebook again. I didn't expect anyone to recognize it. The judge looked up. You've played this before? A few times. And nobody ever reacted? She smiled softly. Most people simply enjoy the music. He nodded slowly. Of course they did. To everyone else, it was just another beautiful melody. Only he knew what it truly was. Or at least what he believed it was. A little girl standing near the front of the crowd tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad, she whispered. Why does that man look so sad? Her father quietly answered. Sometimes music reminds people of someone they miss. The little girl nodded as if she understood. The retired judge heard those words. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit something. He missed his mother every single day. He had simply become too busy to think about it. Years of courtrooms, speeches, awards, and public respect had slowly buried those memories beneath responsibility. Now one unexpected melody had uncovered everything. He looked at the pianist once more. I owe you something. She waited. Not an apology. The crowd looked surprised. He continued. Not yet. Several people frowned. He spoke honestly. I know what I heard, but I don't yet know how you know it. The pianist accepted that answer. That's fair. I need to understand. So do I. For the first time since they met, neither of them sounded like opponents. They sounded like two strangers trying to solve the same mystery. The retired judge glanced once more at the old notebook. May I see it? The young woman hesitated only for a moment before handing it to him. He opened the first page carefully. Most pages contained handwritten notes, small corrections, tiny marks showing where certain fingers should rest. Near the back of the notebook, something caught his attention. A faded sentence had been written in careful handwriting many years earlier. The ink had almost disappeared. He leaned closer. Only a few words could still be read. Keep the melody alive. His breathing slowed. The handwriting looked strangely familiar. Not enough to be certain, but enough to make his heart race once again. He gently closed the notebook and returned it. I think this story began long before either of us realized. The young woman looked at him with quiet curiosity. What happens now? He looked toward the crowd before answering. I need to find someone who remembers the past better than I do. As people slowly began leaving the square, the retired judge walked back toward his waiting car. For the first time in many years, he canceled every meeting scheduled for the next day. There was only one place he wanted to go. The small town where he had spent his childhood. Somewhere in its quiet streets, hidden beneath decades of forgotten memories, he believed the truth was still waiting. The mystery is now set up for part 3, where the retired judge returns to his hometown and begins uncovering the forgotten connection between his mother, the melody, and the pianist's family. The next morning, the retired judge woke much earlier than usual. He barely slept during the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the melody again. It was as clear as it had been in the city square. It brought back memories he had not visited in decades. After making a simple breakfast, he walked into his study. The room was filled with shelves of law books, framed awards, and photographs from different years of his career. Anyone visiting would think this room told the story of his life. But now it felt incomplete. His eyes stopped on one small picture tucked behind a larger frame. It showed him as a young boy sitting beside his mother at an old upright piano. Both of them were smiling. He gently picked it up. I should have remembered sooner, he whispered to himself. Within an hour, he was driving toward the small town where he had spent his childhood. It had been many years since his last visit. Work had always given him another reason to postpone the trip. The roads looked different now. New buildings had replaced empty fields. Small shops had become larger businesses. Still, every few miles, something familiar appeared and reminded him of the past. By the time he reached the town, the morning sun had climbed high into the sky. He parked near the old town square. The place felt quieter than the busy city where he now lived. Some of the buildings had fresh paint. Others looked almost unchanged. A small bakery still stood on the same corner. The old clock tower still marked every hour with its gentle chime. He walked slowly, allowing memories to guide him. Finally, he reached the street where his childhood home had once stood. The house was still there. The fence had been replaced, and the garden looked different, but the building itself remained almost the same. He stood across the street for several minutes without speaking. It felt strange to return after so many years. A woman working in the front yard noticed him. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. "I grew up here," he replied with a small smile. Her expression softened. "You should come closer if you'd like. We bought the house years ago." He thanked her and walked through the small gate. She listened patiently as he explained that his mother had once lived there. "I remember hearing about the family from the previous owner," she said. "They told us your mother loved music." He smiled. "She did." The woman pointed toward the back of the house. "The old piano room is still there. We turned it into a reading room." For a moment, he imagined hearing his mother's laughter coming through the open window. Instead, only birds sang from the nearby trees. After thanking the homeowner, he continued walking through town. His next stop was the local library. It had always been a quiet place, even when he was young. Inside, rows of books stretched from floor to ceiling. Behind the front desk sat an elderly librarian wearing glasses attached to a small chain. She looked up with a friendly smile. "You look familiar," he introduced himself. Her eyes widened. "I remember your mother," she said almost immediately. "You do?" "Of course. She borrowed music books every month." He felt hope growing. "Can you tell me anything about the children she taught?" The librarian thought for a moment. "There were quite a few. I only need anything you can remember." She slowly stood and walked toward a storage room. After several minutes, she returned carrying an old wooden box. "We keep local community records here." Dust covered the lid. She carefully opened it. Inside were newspapers, photographs, and handwritten programs from community events held many years earlier. Together they searched through the papers. Nearly an hour passed. Then the librarian smiled. "I think I found something." She handed him a faded newspaper clipping. The article described a neighborhood music gathering organized by local volunteers. A black and white photograph showed several children standing around a piano. His mother stood behind them, smiling proudly. He looked closely at every face. Most were unfamiliar. One little girl near the front caught his attention. She held a notebook against her chest. The retired judge leaned closer. "It can't be." The librarian adjusted her glasses. "Do you recognize someone?" "I'm not sure." The notebook looked almost identical to the one the street pianist carried. Of course, many notebooks looked alike. Still, something about it felt important. He turned the newspaper over. On the back, someone had written several names in faded blue ink. Most could still be read. One name immediately stood out. It matched the surname the young pianist had mentioned when talking about her grandmother. His heartbeat quickened. "This family lived here?" The librarian nodded. "Yes, they struggled financially." "What happened to them?" "They moved away after the father's factory closed." "Did they stay in touch with anyone?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of." He carefully copied the names into his notebook. Before leaving, he asked one more question. "Does anyone else remember them?" The librarian smiled. "You should visit the old music shop. I thought it closed. The original owner retired. His daughter runs it now." He thanked her warmly and left. The music shop sat only a few streets away. The little bell above the door rang as he entered. Rows of guitars, violins, and keyboards filled the room. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman tuning a violin. She greeted him with a smile. "What can I help you find today?" "I'm looking for memories more than instruments." She laughed softly. "Those are usually harder to find." After hearing his story, her smile slowly faded into thoughtful silence. "My father spoke often about your mother," she said. "Really?" She believed every child deserved the chance to learn music. The retired judge nodded. "That sounds exactly like her." The shop owner walked toward a cabinet in the corner. She opened one drawer and removed an old attendance book from music workshops held many years earlier. She placed it carefully on the counter. These belonged to my father. They turned the pages together. There were dozens of names. Then they found another familiar surname. Again, it matched the young pianist's family. Beside the name was a short note written in pencil. Exceptional musical memory. The retired judge stared at the words. What does that mean? The shop owner smiled. My father used that note for children who could hear a melody once and remember it forever. He remembered the young pianist playing without looking at any sheet music. Perhaps that gift had passed through generations. The shop owner continued reading. There is another note. What does it say? She smiled gently. Received special lessons from volunteer teacher. He already knew who that volunteer teacher had been. His mother. He felt a mixture of pride and sadness. She had quietly changed lives without expecting recognition. As he prepared to leave, the shop owner stopped him. There is someone else you should meet. Who? A retired neighbor who lived beside your family for years. She wrote an address on a small piece of paper. He remembers almost everyone from those days. The retired judge drove across town to a small white house surrounded by flowers. An elderly man answered the door. Though his hair had turned completely white, his eyes remained bright. After hearing why the retired judge had come, the old neighbor invited him inside. I've been expecting someone to ask about those years someday, he said. They sat together over tea. For hours they talked about the neighborhood. The retired judge listened more than he spoke. The old man remembered children gathering after school to hear piano lessons. He remembered laughter filling the street through open windows. Then his expression became more serious. There was one family your mother cared about deeply. The family with the little girl? The neighbor nodded. Yes. What happened to them? The girl's mother became very ill. They couldn't afford lessons anymore? They couldn't afford much of anything. The old man looked toward the window. Your mother refused to let money end that child's dream. The retired judge felt tears forming. She continued teaching? Every week. For free. The old neighbor smiled. She never even mentioned payment. Silence filled the room. Then the neighbor added one final detail. The last day before that family moved away, your mother handed the little girl a notebook. The retired judge's heart skipped. A notebook? Yes. What was inside? The old man looked directly at him. I don't know every page. He paused. But I clearly remember your mother saying one sentence. What did she say? Take these songs with you. One day they may help someone remember where they came from. The retired judge sat frozen. The old notebook. The handwritten music. The mysterious melody. For the first time, the scattered pieces of the story were beginning to fit together. As evening settled over the town, he stepped outside carrying more questions than answers. But one thing had become clear. The young street pianist had never stolen the music. She had inherited something far more valuable. She had been protecting a gift that his own mother had quietly placed into another family's hands many years before. Now he knew there was only one person who could help uncover the rest of the truth. He had to meet the pianist's grandmother. The following morning, the retired judge left the small hotel before sunrise. The town was still quiet. Only a few shop owners were opening their doors, and the streets were almost empty. He held a small piece of paper in his hand. On it was the address the elderly neighbor had given him the day before. According to the neighbor, the young pianist's grandmother had moved back to the town several years earlier after spending most of her life in another city. She lived alone in a modest house at the end of a peaceful road lined with old trees. As he drove there, he thought about everything he had learned. Every new detail pointed in the same direction. His mother had given music to children simply because she believed everyone deserved hope. She had never expected anyone to remember her name. Yet one melody had survived. When he reached the house, he parked beside a small wooden fence covered with climbing flowers. The home was simple but well cared for. A wind chime hanging near the front porch moved gently in the morning breeze. He walked to the front door and knocked softly. After a few moments, the door opened. An elderly woman stood there with kind eyes and silver hair tied neatly behind her head. She smiled politely. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The retired judge introduced himself. For a brief second, her expression changed. She seemed surprised to hear his family name. "I was hoping to speak with you," he said. "If you have a little time." She studied his face carefully before opening the door wider. "Please come in." The house felt warm and welcoming. Family photographs covered one wall. Small potted plants sat near every window. Nothing inside looked expensive, but everything had been cared for with love. She invited him to sit at a small wooden table while she prepared tea. Neither of them spoke much during the first few minutes. Finally, she placed 2 cups on the table and quietly asked, "This is about the melody, isn't it?" He looked at her with surprise. "You already know?" She smiled gently. "My granddaughter told me someone recognized it." He nodded. "I recognized every note." The elderly woman lowered her eyes for a moment. "I wondered if this day would ever come." The room became very still. The retired judge carefully chose his next words. "My mother used to play that melody when I was a little boy." The elderly woman closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with emotion. "I hoped it was still remembered." He leaned forward. "Can you tell me how you learned it?" She took a slow breath before answering. "It was many years ago. I was only a young girl." She looked toward an old photograph hanging on the wall. "My family had almost nothing. My father lost his job, and my mother became ill. We could barely pay our bills. Music lessons were something we could never afford." She smiled faintly. "Then your mother came into our lives." The retired judge listened without saying a word. "She noticed me standing outside the community hall one afternoon. I was listening through an open window while other children learned to play." The elderly woman laughed softly. "I thought nobody could see me." "What happened?" he asked. "She came outside and invited me in. Just like that. Just like that." The retired judge could almost picture the scene. His mother had always believed that a locked door could change someone's future. The elderly woman continued. "I told her I had no money. And what did she say?" A warm smile appeared on her face. "She said music doesn't ask how much money a person has." The retired judge felt his throat tighten. Those words sounded exactly like something his mother would say. The elderly woman continued her story. "She gave lessons every week. Sometimes at the community hall. Sometimes at your home. She never accepted a single coin from my family." She paused for a moment. Instead, she asked only one thing. "What was that?" "She wanted me to practice every day and to help someone else if I ever had the chance." The retired judge smiled sadly. "That was her." The elderly woman stood and walked toward a small wooden cabinet. From the top drawer, she carefully removed an old notebook wrapped in soft cloth. Time had faded the cover, but it was still protected. She placed it gently on the table. "I've kept this safe for more than 40 years. The retired judge looked at it in silence. It was almost identical to the notebook his granddaughter carried while performing. The elderly woman untied the cloth and slowly opened the first page. Inside were handwritten musical notes. Some pages had tiny corrections written in blue ink. Others contained short messages beside the music. The retired judge stared at the handwriting. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to his mother. He reached out carefully, almost afraid to touch the paper. "I've seen this handwriting all my life." The elderly woman nodded. "I thought you might." He turned another page. Between 2 pieces of music was a short sentence. It read, "Play with kindness before skill. Kindness reaches people first." He smiled through tears. His mother used to repeat those same words whenever he became frustrated while learning. The elderly woman watched quietly. "She wrote little reminders throughout the notebook," she explained. "Not only about music, but about life." He continued turning the pages. Another message appeared. "Never use talent to make another person feel small." The retired judge looked down. Those words stayed with him. He remembered the city square. He remembered standing before a crowd. He remembered questioning the young pianist without first asking her story. For the first time since the confrontation, he fully understood how much pain his words might have caused. "I failed to follow my own mother's lesson," he said quietly. The elderly woman shook her head. "No." He looked up. "You simply forgot it for a while." Her answer surprised him. She continued, "Life gives all of us moments when we forget who we wanted to be." He remained silent. She smiled kindly. "The important part is remembering." Those words lifted some of the weight from his heart. After a few moments, she stood once more. "There is something else." She walked to another shelf and brought back a small wooden music box. The finish had become worn with age. She gently wound the key on the side. A soft melody began to play. It was the very same tune that had echoed through the city square. The retired judge listened with tears in his eyes. "My mother gave you this too?" The elderly woman nodded. "It was a farewell gift." "When?" "The day before we moved away." She looked toward the window as if watching the memory happen again. "I cried because I thought I would never play music again." "What did my mother say?" The elderly woman smiled through her own tears. She held my hands and said, "One day you'll teach this melody to someone who needs hope even more than you do." The retired judge slowly looked around the room. Photographs of children and grandchildren covered every wall. "My granddaughter was the first person I taught." She smiled proudly. "She learned quickly." "I can see that." "I never told her who created the melody." "Why not?" "Because your mother asked me not to." He looked surprised. "She said music should be remembered because it touched hearts, not because people remembered her name." The retired judge lowered his head. That sounded exactly like the woman who had raised him. The elderly woman reached across the table and gently closed the notebook. "My granddaughter never lied." "I know. She believed the songs belonged to our family because they had been passed down with love." "I understand now." The room remained quiet for several moments. Then the retired judge spoke again. "I embarrassed her in front of hundreds of people." The elderly woman did not argue. She simply nodded. "I judged her before learning the truth." "You did." "I want to make things right." She smiled warmly. "I believe you can." He looked uncertain. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" The elderly woman laughed softly. "My granddaughter has a kind heart." She paused. "But forgiveness is not something you ask for with words alone." He understood what she meant. Real apologies required action. Before leaving, he carefully thanked her for sharing the notebook and the memories. As he stepped onto the front porch, she called after him. He turned around. "There is one last thing your mother asked me to remember." "What was it?" The elderly woman smiled. "She said the most beautiful music begins after people stop trying to prove they are right and start trying to understand each other." The retired judge stood quietly for a long moment. Those words stayed with him as he walked back to his car. For the first time in many years, he was no longer thinking about winning an argument. He was thinking about earning forgiveness. And he already knew where he needed to go next. He was going back to the city square, not to question the young pianist again, but to stand before the same crowd and tell them the truth he had only just discovered. If you'd like, I can also write part 5 in the same style and continue naturally from this ending. 3 days later, the city square looked much the same as it always did. People hurried to work, children chased birds around the fountain, and street performers slowly set up their places for another busy afternoon. The old piano stood where it always had, waiting for the first song of the day. The young pianist arrived carrying the familiar notebook under one arm. She greeted a few shop owners with a smile before uncovering the piano. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary afternoon. But inside, she felt uncertain. Ever since the public argument with the retired judge, fewer people had stopped to listen. Some still recognized her from the videos that had spread across social media. A few whispered as they walked past. Others looked at her with curiosity instead of trust. She tried not to let it bother her. Her grandmother had always told her that people's opinions could change quickly, but good character stayed with a person for life. So she sat down, placed her hands on the keys and began playing. The first melody floated across the square, calm and gentle as always. A few people slowed their steps. Some stopped to listen. Little by little, the crowd grew. About 20 minutes later, a black car pulled quietly to the side of the square. This time, there was no rush, no confident walk through the crowd. The retired judge stepped out alone. He was dressed simply, without the formal clothes that usually made him stand out. He carried no briefcase and no papers. Only a folded envelope rested in one hand. Several people recognized him immediately. Whispers spread through the crowd. "He's back. I wonder what will happen today. Is he going to question her again?" The young pianist noticed him as well. Her hands paused for only a second before she continued playing. When the song ended, the retired judge slowly walked toward the piano. This time, he stopped several feet away instead of standing over her. He waited quietly until the last note disappeared into the afternoon air. Then he spoke. "May I say something?" The young pianist looked at him for a moment. She gave a small nod. He turned toward the people gathered around them. More and more visitors stopped as they sensed something important was about to happen. Within minutes, hundreds of people filled the square. Many lifted their phones once again. The retired judge looked around at the crowd. His voice was calm. "A few days ago, I stood here and accused this young woman of being dishonest. Nobody interrupted. I believed I was protecting the truth." He paused. "But I spoke before I knew the whole story." The square became completely silent. He continued, "I allowed my own assumptions to become stronger than my willingness to listen." The young pianist watched quietly. She had not expected these words. The retired judge took a slow breath. "I have spent most of my life asking people for evidence before making decisions." He looked down briefly. "But I failed to ask the most important question." He turned toward the pianist. "I never asked you to tell your story." Many people lowered their phones. The moment no longer felt like public drama. It felt deeply personal. The retired judge continued speaking. "After leaving this square, I returned to the town where I grew up." He briefly shared what he had discovered. He spoke about his mother's love of music. He described how she had freely taught children whose families could not afford lessons. He explained how she had given her handwritten notebook to one little girl before that family moved away. Without revealing private details, he told the crowd that the young pianist's family had carefully protected those songs across generations. "The melody I believed belonged only to my childhood survived because another family honored it with kindness." He looked directly at the pianist. "You never claimed credit for what was not yours." She quietly shook her head. "I only played what my grandmother taught me." "I know." His voice became softer. "And I should have trusted you enough to ask before accusing you." A long silence followed. The retired judge unfolded the envelope he had been carrying. Inside was a handwritten letter. "I found this among my mother's belongings." He held it carefully. "It was written many years ago." He smiled sadly. "I don't think she ever expected anyone else to read it." He looked at the young pianist. "But I believe she would want these words shared today." He read aloud. "If music ever becomes a reason to judge another person, then we have forgotten why music exists. Its purpose is not to prove who is better. Its purpose is to remind people they belong to one another." Many people quietly wiped away tears. The retired judge folded the letter again. "My mother understood something that took me many years to learn." He turned fully toward the young pianist. "I am deeply sorry." His apology was simple. There were no excuses, no explanations, no attempt to defend his actions. Just honest regret. "I spoke too quickly. I embarrassed you. I caused people to question your character. For that, I sincerely ask your forgiveness." The entire square remained silent. Everyone waited for her response. The young pianist stood from the piano bench. She walked the few steps toward him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she smiled gently. "My grandmother always says that saying sorry is difficult." The retired judge nodded. "It is. But listening after saying sorry is even harder." He smiled for the first time that afternoon. "I'll remember that." She continued, When you first spoke to me here, I felt hurt. I know. But I also saw something else. He looked surprised. You truly believed you were protecting honesty. I did. You were wrong. Yes. But being wrong doesn't make someone beyond forgiveness. Those words seemed to lift a heavy weight from his shoulders. I accept your apology. A quiet round of applause began somewhere near the back of the crowd. Soon the entire square joined in. Not loud cheering, just warm, respectful applause. The retired judge looked genuinely relieved. Thank you. The young pianist returned to the piano. She looked toward him. Would you like to hear the melody again? He smiled. Very much. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. This time, before she played, the retired judge quietly pulled another chair beside the piano. People watched with curiosity. He did not intend to perform. He simply wanted to sit and listen without interrupting. The melody began once more. The square seemed to slow down. Shop owners paused in their doorways. Bus drivers waiting at nearby lights opened their windows. Even people who had planned to keep walking found themselves stopping. The music carried something different now. It no longer felt connected to doubt or accusation. Felt like healing. When the final note faded away, nobody rushed to speak. The silence itself became part of the performance. Then applause filled the square once again. Longer this time. Warmer. A local newspaper photographer quietly captured the moment. Not the argument. Not the apology. But the retired judge sitting beside the old piano with a peaceful smile while the young woman played. Later that evening, the photograph appeared across local news websites. The story spread quickly. But unlike the first headlines, these focused on understanding instead of conflict. People shared the article because it reminded them that admitting a mistake did not weaken a person's character. It strengthened it. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. More people began visiting the city square. Some came because they loved music. Others came because they had heard about the unusual story behind the old piano. Children gathered near the front to watch the pianist's hands move across the keys. Parents stayed longer than they had planned. Older couples returned week after week. The donation box slowly filled again. Not because people felt sorry for her, because they genuinely appreciated her music. One afternoon, as the retired judge prepared to leave after another performance, he stopped beside the piano. I've been thinking, she smiled. That usually means you have an idea. He laughed softly. I believe this melody deserves to be heard by more people. She closed the notebook gently. My grandmother once said the same thing. I would like to help. She looked at him with curiosity. How? He smiled. I think it's time we create something that lasts much longer than one performance in a city square. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time since they had met, they were no longer connected by misunderstanding. They were connected by a shared purpose. Neither of them knew exactly what that future would look like. But both believed it would begin with the same simple thing that had changed everything. One old piano, one forgotten melody, and one decision to choose understanding over judgment. A few weeks passed, and life in the city slowly settled into its normal rhythm again. The story of the retired judge and the young street pianist had spread far beyond the city square. Local newspapers had written about it. Community groups shared the story online. People did not talk about it because of the disagreement anymore. They talked about what happened after the disagreement. Many people said the most powerful part was not the music. It was the apology. Others said the story reminded them that everyone has a past that cannot be seen at first glance. A few minutes of listening could change an opinion that had formed in only a few seconds. One sunny afternoon, the retired judge visited the pianist again while she was finishing another performance. As the audience slowly walked away, he waited until the last listener had thanked her before walking over. I've been making phone calls all week, he said with a smile. She closed the piano lid. I had a feeling you were planning something. I was. He handed her a folder. Inside were several pages describing a new community project. She read quietly. The retired judge wanted to create a music program for children whose families could not afford lessons. The project would provide free instruments, volunteer teachers, and a safe place where young people could learn without worrying about money. At the top of the first page was a simple sentence. In memory of a teacher who believed music belongs to everyone. The young pianist smiled. You wrote this? I did. She looked up. It sounds like your mother. He nodded. That's exactly what I hoped. He explained that several local businesses had already agreed to help. A community center had offered classroom space every weekend. Retired musicians had volunteered to teach. Even the owner of a nearby music shop promised to repair donated instruments without charging anything. The young pianist continued reading until she reached the last page. There was one line that surprised her. Artistic director. Beneath it was her name. She looked at him in disbelief. I've never managed anything like this. You've already been teaching without realizing it. How? You remind people why music matters. She smiled shyly. I only play the piano. You do much more than that. She became quiet. The responsibility felt larger than she expected. I don't know if I'm the right person. The retired judge smiled kindly. My mother never believed the right person was the one with the most experience. What did she believe? The right person is the one who cares enough to keep learning. Those words gave her confidence. She slowly closed the folder. I'll do my best. I never asked for anything more. Over the next 2 months, dozens of volunteers joined the project. Old classrooms were cleaned and painted, and used pianos were repaired. Shelves filled with music books donated by families across the city. People who had never met before worked side by side. Some donated money. Others donated time. A retired carpenter built music stands by hand. A local cafe provided snacks every Saturday. Teenagers helped younger children carry instruments after lessons. The project became something much bigger than anyone expected. On opening day, children arrived with excited smiles. Some had never touched a piano before. Others held borrowed violins almost as carefully as if they were made of glass. Parents watched from the back of the room. Many of them admitted they never imagined their children would have this opportunity. The young pianist welcomed every family personally. She remembered what her grandmother had once told her. A warm smile is sometimes the first lesson, so she greeted every child by name. No one felt left out. The retired judge watched quietly from the doorway. The room reminded him of his childhood. Years earlier, his mother had welcomed children in exactly the same way. Nothing about the building looked like the old family home. Yet somehow the feeling was identical. Hope filled the room. As the weeks passed, wonderful things began happening. One quiet boy who barely spoke discovered he loved the piano. A little girl who had always been nervous in school became confident whenever she held a violin. 2 brothers who argued constantly learned to play simple songs together. Parents stayed after lessons, talking with one another while children practiced nearby. Friendships formed naturally. The music program slowly became part of the community. One afternoon, the retired judge visited the elderly grandmother. She was sitting in her garden watering flowers. When she saw him walking toward the house, she smiled. I've heard the lessons are going well. They're going better than I ever imagined. He showed her several photographs. Children smiled while holding instruments. Families gathered around pianos. Volunteers laughed together during practice. The elderly woman looked at each picture carefully. When she reached the last one, tears quietly filled her eyes. It showed the young pianist teaching a little girl how to play the same melody that had started everything. The grandmother gently touched the photograph. It continues. The retired judge nodded. Yes, my friend would have been very happy. He knew she meant his mother. I think so too. The elderly woman smiled toward the garden. Some people leave behind money. She paused. Others leave behind kindness. She looked at him. Kindness lasts longer. Several months later, the city announced its annual community festival. This year, organizers invited the young pianist and her students to perform on the main stage. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the outdoor platform. Families spread blankets across the grass. Children waved excitedly from the front rows. The retired judge sat quietly among the audience instead of accepting the special seat reserved for him. He wanted to experience the performance like everyone else. The concert began with simple songs played by the youngest students. Not every note was perfect. Sometimes fingers slipped. Sometimes children laughed after making mistakes. Nobody minded. Every small performance received warm applause. Finally, the young pianist walked onto the stage. She thanked everyone for supporting the community music program. Then she invited one special guest to join her. The retired judge looked surprised. He slowly walked onto the stage as the audience applauded. She placed an old wooden chair beside the piano. "I'd like you to sit here." He smiled. "I still don't know how to play." "You don't have to." He sat down. She looked toward the audience. Some melodies become famous because millions of people hear them. She rested her hands on the keys. Others become important because they help people remember who they are. The familiar melody filled the evening air once again. This time it sounded different. Not because the notes had changed, but because everyone listening understood its journey. A song that once belonged to one family had become a gift shared by an entire community. As the final note faded, the audience rose to its feet. The applause continued for several minutes. The retired judge looked across the crowd. Then he quietly looked upward, smiling to himself. He imagined his mother somewhere beyond sight, hearing the melody once more. Not played inside a small living room, not hidden inside an old notebook, but alive in hundreds of hearts. After the concert ended, children surrounded the piano, asking questions and laughing together. The young pianist patiently answered every one. The retired judge watched from nearby. He realized something important. Years earlier, he believed justice meant finding the truth and protecting it. Now he understood another lesson. Sometimes truth also required listening. Sometimes it required admitting mistakes. And sometimes the greatest act of justice was giving someone the chance to be heard. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the city buildings, the old piano was carefully covered for the night. The square became quiet again. People walked home carrying more than memories of beautiful music. They carried a reminder that kindness can travel farther than anger, that understanding is stronger than quick judgment, and that one person's simple act of generosity can continue changing lives long after they are gone. The melody that had once lived only in a mother's heart would never be forgotten again. It would continue through every child who learned it, every teacher who shared it, and every listener who understood that the greatest gifts are not always the ones we keep for ourselves, but the ones we pass on to others with love.